everybody. Thank you for everybody who is joining us. My name is Iman Awad, and I am so fortunate to be here for Young Leaders Institute, their 4th 2020 Youth Conference, which is a virtual meetup and national conversation about the impact of COVID-19 on the lives of young people across the country and around the world. For those of you who are new to Young Leaders Institute, it is a youth leadership platform that equips young people with leadership skills in the areas of interpersonal skills development, conflict resolution, character education, ethical leadership, and civics. YLI also offers year-round mentorships and internships to high school students and to college students across various disciplines and leadership roles. So for our young listeners, YLI is open, taking internships and mentorships, and I hope after this conversation you're all inclined to join. Today, we're bringing you a discussion on the impact of COVID-19 on the 2020 elections and the role of young people in this election cycle. One of the most interesting facts that I actually learned from Nadia right before this call is that for the first time ever in US history, millennials and new voters are going to be making up the largest voting bloc over all of the demographic groups. So what does this mean? This means that millennials and new voters have the power to change things. We have the power to be heard through our votes and the power to impact the election through our expressions of who we'd like to see run our country. We're very fortunate to have some excellent speakers joining us here today. We do have two people who identify as Republicans. We have one Democrat from the Biden campaign. Specifically, they're going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the elections, the power of young voters, voter suppression, and electability. Just to give you an idea, we're just to have a conversation for the first about 45 minutes. And towards the end, we will be opening this up to questions. Throughout the presentation, as you develop your questions, feel free to use the chat box. I will be monitoring all those and making sure our panelists are aware of any questions directed towards them. Without any further ado, I do want to just talk a little bit more about YLI and the founder. I've actually had the pleasure of knowing Nadia Hassan for quite some time. She is the founder, fearless leader of YLI. And when we connected, it must have been back in 2009 in Maryland. I saw YLI as just an idea, and I've seen it completely flourish now into what it is. So on a personal note, this is something I'm very committed towards. At this time, I do want to open it up and introduce our speakers here today. We have Mr. Sohail Khan, Ms. Sarah Basha, and Farouk Mita. In the interest of time, I'm going to let each individual start off by just introducing themselves, and I would love to start with you, Sohail.
Thanks, Iman, and I'm really grateful to Young Leaders for including me in this fairly important discussion. My background is I'm originally from California, grew up in California, went to Cal Berkeley for undergrad. That's where I started getting involved in the political arena, volunteering on campaigns, and really, haven't looked back since. I've worked on local campaigns for city council, county supervisor, all the way up to presidential campaigns. I worked on Capitol Hill for 5 years for my hometown congressman. And then I served on the staff of George W. Bush when he was president for 8 years in different capacities. And since then, I've been working in the private sector, both in the nonprofit world, doing international religious freedom work, and then also working for a fairly well-known tech company. But I really am grateful for the opportunity to be with you today and looking forward to our discussion.
Okay, thanks, Sohail. Sarah, we'll start next with you.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having us on, or having me on. I'm just a regular person who's been heavily involved in minority representation and civic engagement efforts. I started out on a local campaign for a person that was running for a Senate seat, got involved in civic engagement that way, and I've stayed kind of involved over the years. I now serve as a delegate to the 10th District here in Virginia, so I kind of threw my hat back in the ring and started doing things again after I took a break from politics and got into more of the corporate world where I do consulting. So yeah, that's me, basically.
Great, thank you. We're going to touch a little bit about the importance of local politics later on. Last but not least, Farouk.
Great, thanks, Iman. It's really great to be here with everyone and with old friends on the panel. My name is Farouk Mita. I'm currently a senior advisor to Vice President Biden's campaign. I'm originally from Florida, where I started volunteering on campaigns while I was in college. Volunteered on President Obama's campaign, Went to law school, and after law school, I took a job in the Obama administration when I moved to DC in the Department of Defense. And since that time, I've been in and around politics in DC. I'm the co-founder of an organization called Engage, and just 2 months ago joined the Biden campaign to help with the political team, specifically on Muslim American engagement.
Great, thanks, Farouk. I want to highlight that, I mean, I think this is going to be a great discussion. We have representatives from the former Obama administration, representatives from the former Bush administration, and especially during these political times, we're going to get a little tough and talk about what does it mean to be identified as a Republican? What does it mean to be identified as a Democrat? But first, let's start off with the obvious elephant in the room. I'm going to start with you, Farouk, actually, with the Biden campaign. How has the shutdown impacted the campaign, and how are you guys staying in touch with voters?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I hope everybody's families are staying safe in this difficult time in the country. We've actually been completely virtual, actually since the time that I joined. I joined the campaign in March. We went virtual, so I haven't met a lot of my colleagues in person, which has been very interesting. But we're doing things virtually. We're finding ways to get engaged and stay engaged through Zoom. The vice president is currently at his home in Delaware, where he's built a studio in his basement, and he's doing a lot of TV interviews, virtual events. You may have seen recently on CNN where they interviewed him in his backyard, sometimes on his porch. So we're not doing any public events right now because he specifically is following the stay-at-home orders that are in place from the governor of Delaware. So he's doing things virtually. All of our events are virtual. I spend hours a day on Zoom talking to communities across the country, and all of us are doing the same thing, whether it's fundraising, political outreach. It's all being done virtually. I will say that social media, digital organizing has also been important. So we're finding ways to do our own live stream events when we can't have the vice president on national TV, for example, but everything has gone virtual, and unsure of when that'll change. You may have saw on Memorial Day weekend, the vice president and Jill Biden went and did their first kind of anything outside, where they went to a Memorial Day memorial in Delaware. That's kind of the only thing that we've done outside of being virtual. So, and that wasn't really even an event. So we'll see how things develop.
Excellent. And just as people who are civically engaged, this one's for you, Sohail and Sarah. What kind of concerns do you guys have in the direction of the 2020 elections and this pandemic?
Well, there are just, several layers, because we just have so much uncertainty, unfortunately, as to what's going to happen. I was on a call this morning with friends talking about the conventions. Of course, the Republican convention will be in Charlotte, North Carolina in late August. And prior to that, the Democratic convention will be in Milwaukee. And what does that mean? Normally, it would be 4 days of thousands of people in the convention hall, at local meeting places, gatherings at restaurants for dinners, events, panel discussions. And now, again, with the COVID situation, that's really up in the air. Both conventions are proceeding, but we don't know exactly what that's going to mean. But as has already been said, a lot of that is going to be virtual. Even if there is going to be a number of delegates in each of the respective conventions, there will be a virtual component. And that actually might be a good thing, because as has already been said, that brings in people that may not necessarily have the opportunity or the financial wherewithal to travel, get a hotel, or even be a delegate for a particular convention, but maybe they can tune in from their living room and kind of hear and participate in a particular part of the convention. So that's really the challenge. And then we get to the challenge, of course, of voting. And we can talk about in more detail, because we live in a federal system, so that will vary state to state, and what the rules will be, how folks can vote either in person or by mail will vary. And it'll be so important for people to know beforehand, before election day, what they can do, what the opportunities are, so they can get their vote in. And then in between that, we're going to have this presidential election. And not only the presidential, but we'll have governor's races, we'll have congressional races, and there'll be a new way of campaigning. It may not be the door-to-door type of campaigning and big rallies that we're used to. It might be some of that, as hopefully this pandemic begins to wane. But I think there will be, as has been said, a large virtual component. And what does that mean for rural and urban communities that don't have access to broadband internet or may not have access to the technologies that you need for us to be in a forum like we are right now? So that also will draw some attention to the needs of our society so that we can make sure that all Americans can participate in their democracy.
Yeah, so I guess I'll go then. Yeah, I think the two challenges that we face now are pretty much what corporations are facing. There's definitely a change in how we are going to be communicating with each other. I think the challenge for these elections is going to be how sophisticated are constituents in using digital tools to participate, and how are campaigns going to be using those digital tools, and what are going to be the effects, but also just judging from how polarizing the atmosphere is nowadays, what is the willingness of the average person to actually go out and get their absentee ballot and get involved? I mean, is there an inundation of information online because people are at home and that's their only kind of window to the outside world? Are they going to actually pick up on the noise about the election? So I think it'll be really interesting, just as it's going to be really interesting to see how workforces morph into something different when we get out of COVID-19. It's going to be the same in politics, like how much digital information is going to be proliferated, how much are we going to be using all different types of platforms, how are people going to be using online tools to sort of gather their supporters, and also how are people going to feel about, is it going to be effective for them to stay home and get involved, or do they want to, are they going to feel motivated basically because there's so much to do online? Is this going to be a priority, or are people just going to be apathetic and say, this is just more noise among all the other noise? And so, yeah, I think digitally, and also in terms of the polarized nature of how things are nowadays, it's going to be interesting to see how these elections turn out.
Definitely. On that note, I do want to toss something out for all three of you just to conversate amongst yourselves. There was two key things that I just heard right now is the importance of utilizing virtual platforms. Part one of my question is, do you feel you're seeing any campaigns that are really utilizing this well, or perhaps not enough? And the second thing I heard that both you, Sarah, and Sohail brought up was the accessibility to having internet, that you can utilize these virtual platforms, or having the wherewithal to go and get your absentee ballot. With the election being so important on so many minds, what kind of concerns do you have of any waning interest as the pandemic continues and people may not take the initiative to go out and get their absentee ballot and be a part of the civic process? So that's my two-part question, whoever wants to start.
Well, I'll jump in. I think what we're going to see is there will be a lot of information. And just as we've been kind of in information overload just about the pandemic, for example, and if you get on your Facebook page or on Twitter, you see all kinds of information and you have to sift through it and determine, is that true? Is taking this drug helpful? Is this drug in fact unhelpful? Can you spread the disease from, surfaces? Can your pets get the disease? And if, these last 3 months, each of us have been information consumers, and we've really had to determine what's truth, what's fact, and what's fiction. And of course, we each in our own society have our own validators. So we might rely on our local mayor or governor for information. Some people might rely on federal officials, the president, Dr. Fauci, and different people have different validators, or we might just rely on our neighbor or a friend, or we might have a family member who might be a physician or a nurse. And so likewise, in that same way, I think it's going to be very much, an overload situation where we're going to have lots of information from the various candidates. Candidates are going to find creative ways to contact voters by phone, by text, on the social media platforms, perhaps in the old-fashioned ways by knocking on doors, depending on how things go, at rallies and other events. And I think it's going to be up to each of us to really sift through that information, determine what's real, determine what's best for us. And when it comes to important things like getting your registration in on time, where's your polling place, can you vote from home, when do you need to get your absentee ballot registration in, and all those types of things, it's really going to be up to each of us to get that information in a timely manner. And we're going to have to really take some responsibility to perhaps log into the Secretary of State's website in our respective states, or listen to our local political and elected officials to say and hear, hey, what does election day mean? You know, we still haven't even got through the primaries for some states. Massachusetts, for example, has a very contested primary for a sitting US senator. And so there are still a lot of things that need to be determined. The good news is, because I always want to be positive, that technology is a tool that is allowing for each of us to do a lot of things virtually. But it is a situation where we have to be, really smart consumers when it comes to that information. And then we need to execute when it comes to registration, voting, determining which candidates we like, and finding out what information is true about those candidates. And this was all, in place before COVID, but now it's kind of got, on steroids post-COVID, because now we're relying so much on technology for that information.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that, I guess, Sahel touched on the right factor. It's basically the level of sophistication of two elements in the voting world. It is the sophistication of campaigns in terms of how are they using their platforms, what digital platforms do they have, and how effective are they, and how are they going to put them on steroids and start using them. But also it's a level of sophistication of the voter themselves. How are they able to go through the stuff that's extremely polarizing? How are they supposed to sort through their issues and know where to turn to what source to get all right information in order to vote on the right issues? So this is a real test. This whole atmosphere is a real test as to how we're going to be using our politics or using all these platforms at the same time to get out the vote, basically.
Yeah, and if I can add a couple things. One is in terms of the virtual platforms, really the barrier to entry. I mean, there's definitely challenges to not campaigning in person, but we've lowered the barrier to entry to do things like this, where people from all over the country can join. And I'm literally doing events every day based out of my home in DC, where I can actually engage multiple states and multiple communities without having to travel anywhere and from one spot. So I think there is some benefit to that, to be able to touch more people. I'm a little bit concerned. I'm very concerned actually about fear. COVID has really taken a toll mostly on Black and Brown communities across the country. And when we talk about absentee voting and misinformation, I think that the misinformation and voter suppression could become major issues. So I'm hoping that it doesn't become a partisan issue as we get closer, because really everybody should be wanting as high of a turnout as possible. And I think if everyone can use that theme as we push to think through, do we expand early voting? Do we expand absentee voting? How do we create more opportunities for people to vote and have consistent information so there aren't people that are discouraged or afraid to go vote? I think those types of things are going to be really important.
I think, Farouk, you bring up a good point, and it's a matter of trust as well. It's like, how can we trust that what we usually would go out and do in person and have that one-on-one contact? How can we trust that what we're seeing online, what we're experiencing online, what we're getting in terms of information is something that we can trust? So I think you're right about that. People, that level of sophistication I was talking about, but at the same time, there are always going to be people out there trying to do manipulative things, and that's what we have to be careful, is to make sure that we are truly representing people regardless of party. It just has to be a true representation. And in the digital age, that's always going to be a little bit more challenging than it is when you kind of physically go in and put your ballot in the box and physically go meet with candidates.
Just to expand a little bit more on this topic, since YLI is really geared towards what would be a contingency of new voters, this could be a lot of people that are listening on Facebook Live or joined us on Zoom today, their first election. So what would be your biggest piece of advice to new voters right now who have to navigate this different system, yet they've never voted before?
Well, I think it's a really exciting time. I remember my first election and, registering to vote and realizing that now I can exercise that franchise. Right before the COVID crisis hit, I was fortunate enough to travel with Congressman John Lewis to Selma, Montgomery, and the other sites of the civil rights movement on the 55th anniversary of him walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And this was a big political delegation, Democrats, Republicans. We had 75 or so elected officials, including the speaker and several other representatives. And it was amazing to be there and to walk in his footsteps. And so we can't take for granted our franchise. And as Farouk mentioned, there is definitely a level of fear that all people might have when it comes to contact, going to events with big crowds, and even going to vote on election day. And that's something that we need to definitely take seriously. And so my thought is that for young people, really what I would recommend is make sure that you get registered as soon as you can, as soon as you're allowed to. In some instances, you can register before you're 18 as long as you're 18 on election day. And so you don't have to wait till you're 18. For those of you who have time and have an interest, I would really recommend volunteering in some way. Now, because again, of technology, you can volunteer on campaigns without even leaving your home. You can, again, text people. You can be part of virtual forums. Unfortunately, you may not be able to meet the candidate in person that you support, or hopefully at some point you might be able to, but you'll very much be able to participate in those forums. And in that way, by doing, you can learn. I learned so much by volunteering on campaigns. And, you know, my first campaign was decades ago, but I still continue to volunteer to go work on campaigns. It's taken me all over the country. In many cases, the campaigns, when it comes to actually physically, you know, recruiting volunteers, they will actually pay if you have the time and interest to go to a battleground state. As we get closer to election day, they'll cover your flight and expenses, your hotel, and it's just an amazing experience. So whether you can just do it here and there for a few hours from your home, or you might be able to devote a significant time over the summer or as we get into the fall right before the election, I would really consider making that jump just to learn about how vibrant and exciting our democracy is.
Actually, Iman, I am actually living that right now. I have an 18-year-old in the house, and this is going to be his first time voting. And I think, like with other 18-year-olds who are now more focused on what happened to my graduation, what happens to me in come fall semester, I don't know if their focus is on who am I going to vote for and what's going on at a local level in the elections. So I think you bring up a good point. I think depending on the atmosphere that they have in the home, whether their parents are politically engaged or, you know, civically engaged, there is a different, I mean, you're going to find a varied level of interest, but it is tough to tell a young person who is now faced with the challenges of COVID-19 to their whole paradigm now at this point to start thinking about elections and things that are sort of foreign to them because they've never really been in that world. So I think it's on parents a lot to kind of help guide them and show them how the system works and how to take advantage of it, because it kind of, you could kind of say that to some degree the loss of control, or the feeling of a loss of control, can be sort of I don't know, you can make up for it by giving them a sense of control that your vote counts, so here's what you can do to get involved and stay involved. And it would be a great precedent to set in a really tough time, so that later on down the road they'll remember that even though it was really hard, I did participate, and it just set a precedent for me to always do that.
Yeah, I agree with what both Suhail and Sarah said. And just to add, I think talking to young or new voters about the issues is really important. To second what Sarah said about your vote counting, you know, we're living in a really interesting time, and a lot of issues that are just bubbling up that have to be addressed now. There's the economic issues, there's healthcare issues of the cost of healthcare, there's the cost of going to college issues, there's climate change. All of these things are essentially on the ballot. So the vote matters, because that's what will impact the decisions that are made on the issues that are affecting young people's ability to earn a living or to live in a safe society in a country that's still a leading country, or the leading country in the free world. So I think talking about issues is also really an important way to hopefully get people excited.
And just to highlight, especially for for folks who may need more resources, YLI is actually very good at not only helping leaders navigate the voting system, but also helping them place them into different volunteer roles. So I just wanted to make a plug there for YLI and what they do offer as resources.
And if I could just add, one of the major elements for young people and for people of all ages is a social element. And, and while we've been kind of cooped up at home and have been social distancing, one of the benefits of working on a campaign or volunteering or getting involved in an issue, and of course it doesn't have to necessarily be a candidate. Many states have ballot initiatives that can be very meaningful. Of course, all of us right now are reeling from the horror that occurred in Minneapolis this week and have concerns about criminal justice issues. And if people really want to have some engagement on those issues, there are a lot of ways they can get involved. It doesn't necessarily have to be for a candidate per se. And I can tell you, having worked on campaigns, that win or lose, you make lifelong friends, you get involved, you feel like you're making a difference, and that can be very meaningful, not only for your well-being as an individual and feeling like you're participating in your society and contributing to your society, but also down the line you learn, and those learning experiences can really help build your knowledge base and your social and your really your Rolodex, as it were, figuratively speaking, in people that you engage with that you may not necessarily engage with, but for this issue campaign or this political campaign. So that can be very exciting as well.
Yeah, and I wanted to take this opportunity to segue into part of the tougher conversation that you just touched on, Suhail, especially what we just saw in Minneapolis. I mean, we have seen George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor. This is a very real issue, and I see a lot of the my young cousins who are, social distancing. They're by themselves and really trying to process what's happening in this country. I do want to just take an opportunity to have a conversation with all three of you about. As we're mourning the loss of life from COVID-19, we're also mourning the very real consequences of what's happening with the police brutality, Black Lives Matter. And just to talk about what does this mean now for these 2020 elections, regardless of what party you are, what can we do and how are we going to address the racial injustice we continue to see?
Well, I definitely think that when it comes to this issue, even as a conservative, I don't think it's a partisan issue. This is about humanity. This is about being an American. And so I think in terms of what we're already feeling, the stress of COVID-19, this kind of adds to it. I think my biggest fear is that we keep focusing perhaps on the negative and unable to understand that this might be an opportunity for us to rethink how we've been functioning all these decades and try to make some really substantive changes that come from a bipartisan angle rather than find it as an opportunity to take advantage of things. I think, like I said, this is like a huge test of how things will work on multiple levels, but definitely it's been tough to wake up to different news every day that sort of adds to the COVID atmosphere, but at the same time makes us realize it's sort of like a bubbling pot. It's like all of America's ills and their issues are kind of bubbling up in the pot, and it may be an opportunity for us to look at them and be very honest with ourselves about what needs to change and what the reality is. And I think that for the Republican Party, it should be an opportunity for us to kind of see exactly how are we even ignoring or addressing this issue, whether it's at local levels or at the federal level. I mean, are we handling things in a truly just manner that kind of panders to the original values of our founding fathers, or is it are we just being opportunistic? So yeah, it's a real time for self-reflection, I think.
I'll agree with that. I've been working in the political and policy arena now for several years, and I can tell you that, as Sarah said, this issue, criminal justice reform, racial justice, has become very much a bipartisan issue. It's really not divided by partisanship. It's divided by generational shifts and generational, I would say, viewpoints that may not be as relevant in today's world. And so I find that it's younger Republican and Democratic lawmakers on Capitol Hill that are coming together to work together and and take on this issue. Last year, I was proud to be part of passage of the First Step Act, which was just, a first step in criminal justice reform. It passed in a bipartisan manner through the House and Senate, and then was signed by the president, and begins that legislative process on a federal level. But there's so much more that we need to do on the federal level and on the state and local level when it comes to reforming our criminal justice system, our prison system, our juvenile justice system. My little brother is a public defender in Santa Clara County who's been working for several years in this arena. So I talk to him and learn firsthand what's happening in the trenches and many of the injustices that Americans face when it comes to these challenges. And so it's a real opportunity, as unfortunately we are seeing on our, on our handheld devices and our television sets, the horror that occurred in Minneapolis, that this is a challenge that is unfortunately nationwide, but it takes good people working together hand in hand from both sides of the aisle to really address this issue. There is a capacity for that on all levels. And it's just a matter, again, of people engaging. And again, it's really young people that are making that difference when they engage and make their voice heard.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that was said, and these racial justice issues are really critical for us to pay attention to and to try to solve collectively. I do agree that it should be a bipartisan issue, but at times it hasn't been. And I think for young people, we really have to look at it, and I'm going to be kind of put my little bit of a partisan hat on maybe here, but like leadership really matters, right? I mean, what the people at the top are saying is really important, and it's followed by millions and millions of people across the country. So when we go and look at how that fits into the context of voting in November, we really have to think about who are the types of people that we want at the state, local, and federal levels representing us, and are they willing to take a stand on these issues and say what's right and recognize the fact that African Americans and other minorities have been dealing with these issues for decades. It just so happens that we have now, cameras on our phones and social media in ways that are really exposing something that's been around for a long time. So I think when we think about the election, we just have to keep all those things in perspective as well, not just for the president, but for all of our elected leaders.
Yeah, can I just add to that the fact that, I mean, what Sahil and Farouk said is really important, and I've noticed that in civic engagement efforts, everything in politics is like everything else. It's about relationships. So the best way to have a strong relationship is to start local. So if people stop living in silos in their communities and started building those relationships, it doesn't really matter if the leadership is tainted in any way. You can make a difference if you know your neighbor, if you know the people in your neighborhood, if you know the neighborhood next door. So I'd encourage people to stop living in silos, start to get to know one another, and also just get involved in your local politics, because that's the foundation of everything. That's where it's going to grow from. It's sort of like throwing a stone in a pond. The ripples start out close, and then they wane as you go. And so local elections, local issues, local participation is so critical to us making change on the ground that kind of translates into changing leadership at the top eventually. So while federal elections are very sexy and fun, the real power lies in what you can control in your own backyard, whether or not you can have your stop sign put up, how much education your kids are getting, who your local representative is, what's happening at the park in your area. These things are so important, and it doesn't matter what race or social background you come from. If you're going to come together on those types of issues, you're building that strength that you need eventually to overcome these issues. And you don't have to have a top-down approach to social justice as much.
On that note, I do want to circle back, and I appreciate it bringing up the importance of the bipartisan aspect of how to really make impactful change, and especially the discussion of local politics. My dad is, we tease him, he's a card-carrying Republican. He hasn't actually voted Republican since Bush's first election. But there's a point here where we have to look beyond party politics, understand what does this mean, and look at not just the local, but also really hold federal officials accountable of how are they engaging their constituency? What does their constituency look like? And are they mirroring the actual needs within their community. So I do want to touch up a little bit about how do we see parties engaging with diverse communities, and what can elected officials and candidates at this part right now where we're so polarized, what can they do better to authentically boost diversity and inclusion?
Well, I think, as has been said time and time again in political arenas, that all politics is local, and Sarah touched upon that. In the end, politicians, elected officials, candidates, they want to get elected. And so, they have a miraculous way of finding voters where they are, and oftentimes learning how to touch those voters. And those that fail to do so lose their election. So, they learn quickly that they have to engage with voters. And if that means, I know, for example, I've met members of Congress that have been serving their constituents for decades, and they'll find their constituents will change over time through demographic changes and border changes, et cetera. And some of them are very agile in reaching out to the new people that are coming into their district, reaching out to those voters, and they thrive. And others, for a host of reasons, just fail, and they fail miserably, and then they lose those elections. And so I think what's important is, as has already been said, first of all, engaging with elected officials. If they have town halls, if they have teleforums, if they have virtual town hall meetings, attending those. If they have them in person, going there, listening, asking a question, learning, maybe sticking around after the events if they're physical, to meet the elected official, meet their staff. If you have a follow-up question, asking them that question. These are the types of things that, even if the elected official or the candidate doesn't reach out to you, you're doing the outreach to them. And sometimes it can be friendly, and sometimes it can be a little more hard-nosed to say, hey, look, we're this particular community in your district, and you've never come to our community center, you've never come to our school, you never come to our neighborhood. And it might, be a little tougher than, both sides might like. But that's what politics is about. It's about representation. It's about having your voice heard. And I think that that's so important. I can tell you that for years growing up in California, the growing community in California, of course, were both the Asian and the Hispanic communities that were new Americans that were coming into California. Some of them had been there for years but had been invisible. But over time, the different candidates developed the muscle to reach out to those different communities, to speak perhaps in the language that they were comfortable in, to learn about the issues, and some didn't. And those that did thrived, and those that didn't have become something of, question marks in history. So it's an ongoing process. And I can tell you there are parties that do it well one election cycle, and then they fail miserably the next one because they become complacent. So it's ongoing. It's always an ongoing, growing challenge. But for those of you who want to get involved and want to make your voice heard, it starts with you.
Yeah, I think one other thing to think about is as we do this type of engagement, from a presidential campaign all the way to, a local campaign, we really have to make sure that our campaigns are diverse and that the leadership of the campaigns are diverse, the staff. And if the candidate wins, we have to make sure that their staff on the governing side, and if it's an administration or a congressional office or a state legislative office, it also reflects the diversity of the country and their district. And I think if we find ways of intentionally bringing and empowering people from diverse communities, it really makes a difference in inspiring others in those communities to get involved. So I think that's another thing to consider as well.
I want to add to that, because that's actually, we've been pretty friendly so far. It's one difference, I would say, is the approaches to our parties. And that is, as an outsider of the Democratic Party, I find that the Democratic Party is better, and also I would say hung up on having voices that represent certain communities in order to reach out to those communities. And I would argue that the Republican Party is sometimes not as good as we should be in our outreach. But on the flip side, in a positive way, we're not as hung up on having a particular person to do the outreach from that community. To give you an example, when I worked for George W., I did outreach to various communities, including Eastern Europeans, the Christian community. I don't happen to be Christian. To the Catholic community, I don't happen to be Catholic. And I can tell you, for the most part, those communities when we did that outreach on behalf of the president, were grateful that someone from the White House was talking to them and engaging with them. So I just want to, be careful that one of the things that attracted me to the conservative movement as a 17-year-old, as a freshman at Berkeley, was that I wasn't being pigeonholed as a particular person of a particular race or religion or ethnic background, that I could only talk to those communities, that I could do and work on any issue I wanted to on a campaign or in a political position based on what my interests were and not what my resume or my ethnic or personal background might say I should only be limited to. So I agree with you. You want to have people that are sensitive to the community's interests, whatever that community might be, but I don't want to limit that engagement to people only of that community, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that. And I guess for me, it's more about the, for example, in the federal government, the executive branch, if you have not just on the engagement piece, but also on the policy making piece and on the governing piece, that those diverse communities are represented, not necessarily for their communities, but for their expertise.
Right.
So I think that's actually more important than the engagement side.
I hear you.
I'd like to add that, Sohail, that very factor that got you interested at the age of 17 in the party is actually a very different reality today. It's kind of morphed, and we all know that. And sometimes I speak truth to power in the sense that I'm willing to say that in Virginia, our prevalent problem is that our Republican Party is weak at understanding and analyzing and working inclusively with the changing demographics of the area. Just in the area that I live, in the 10th district, there's been an influx of South Asian Americans, Arab Americans, have been a lot of Indians and people from different ethnic backgrounds. And yet I feel like sometimes our party doesn't want to understand their constituents, and it's just a steamroller attitude. And to me, that will be the demise of the proper Republican Party that we recognize and were inspired to join based on the value system. So I would like to see personally us as a party rallying everybody in recognition of the changing demographics and being inclusive of people, but also sticking to the original value systems that we had. And that means kind of winning people over instead of using whatever means possible to either steamroller and ignore or just kind of like vet them in underhanded ways. So to me, the recognition of the changing demographics of America as an immigrant nation is key to either of the parties surviving. Democrats do it a heck of a lot better, and I know how they do it, and I'm not going to speak to that right now because I've been exposed to it and I've seen how they do it, and it kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. But at the same time, I see the other side not making a genuine effort either. So I'm not putting blame on either side per se, but I'm just saying the Achilles heel of the Republican Party, especially out here in Virginia. I mean, I think we do a lot better than a lot of other southern states, but the Achilles heel is definitely not understanding and embracing the fact that demographics in this area have changed and are changing.
I agree with you 100%. And, we saw in the 2018 elections and the midterms where we lost in important key suburbs like Northern Virginia and like Atlanta, like Houston, Orange County. Many of these places were Republican strongholds for decades. And we had significant losses from a party perspective because of just what you said, that we didn't, as I said earlier, recognize the demographic changes that were occurring right underneath us in our local districts. And so you're absolutely right. That's why I said it's a dual-edged sword, really, on both sides of the aisle. And some cycles we do it better than others. And sometimes it takes a catastrophic defeat to wake up politicians to say, hey, we just lost an election in a district that we've had for 50, 60 years because we didn't realize that there is a new community or new communities in our district that we haven't touched. You're absolutely right. I 100% agree with you. And that's for, just as we said, for the top-down leadership, but also the bottom-up grassroots to agitate, to demand our representation, and in some cases, to run for office ourselves. And we are, talking about young voters. One of the great things that I've been excited to see in recent years is younger and younger people are now getting engaged not only to vote, to register and vote, but also to run for office. People can't wait until they turn 25 so they can run for Congress. They can't wait until they turn 30 so they can run for the US Senate. And so that might be another way to really, power is not usually handed out. You have to take it. And so that might be something as a wake-up call for all Americans, regardless of their ethnic or national origin, to get involved. They might say, look, I don't hear someone talking about the issues that are important to me, and so I'm going to stand and put my name on the ballot so I can at least raise those issues, and if I win, I can legislate and continue to promote those issues in the legislative arena.
I just want to say I appreciate how real this conversation is getting. I think that we're taught not to talk about politics, but it's so important for us to be able to freely express ourselves and to understand, how these definitions of what a Republican is, what a Democrat is so nebulous. And I do want to take a moment. I've been sitting on this question, and I think that it's an appropriate time to bring it up. How would you talk to a young person who is Republican leaning but doesn't like President Trump? And to make it work for you, Farouk, too, what about the young leaders who were so pro-Bernie and now, they're just expressing their disappointment of a Biden candidacy? So I'll open that up to all three of you.
Oh, I love that one. So honestly, I would say to a young person, have faith in the system, because I do understand that when the people at the top are speaking rhetoric and kind of polarizing the nation, everyone can turn around and feel like they're in a dictatorship or feel very threatened when it comes to our democracy. But what we have to understand is we have three wings to our nation's, it's a system that works together. So we have the legislative, the executive, and these three, and the judicial, these three are supposed to designed to be checks and balances. And I know people get annoyed and say, well, they're not working very well, but you have to understand that it was designed so that it does work as well as humanly possible. So for those of you that feel, kind of disenfranchised or lost, or like, okay, this is too messy, I don't want to get into it, just understand that the system is set up very beautifully. And if it's done right, and change is always something that's needed, and there's no such thing as everything set in stone. You have to adapt to your times, but remain true to your foundation. If you can understand how the system works and work it yourself and use it to your advantage, and understand that no particular person in either one of those three branches can reign supreme, you will feel more comfortable with how you can participate as well. So don't be discouraged. Definitely know that your voice counts. Stay involved, learn the system, and always be critical in your thinking. I think a lot of us tend, because we're getting so much messaging in multi-directional ways, we're just fixated on particular things, and we get into those little silos I talked about, and we stick with that one belief. But listen to multiple views and try to be critical of it. So yeah, one is have faith in the system. The other is be open to other types of views, and open your mind to discovering who you are and where you fit in.
I would agree with everything that Sarah said. I have seen that the system works. Sometimes it doesn't work as quickly as we would like. And particularly there's some impatience. The younger I was, the more impatient I was. But over time, the system definitely does work. Those checks and balances do function. And I would say, back to your original question, Iman, what drew me to the conservative side of the political arena, and I always try to differentiate that I'm a conservative first, a Republican second. I'm a conservative because I believe that fundamentally individuals are best suited to make decisions for themselves when it comes to their healthcare, their economic decisions, their personal retirement, other types of personal decisions, that in the end, I can make those decisions better than some elected official or bureaucrat. And so that's where, my philosophy is really centered, that I have more faith in myself and my ability to make decisions that govern myself, my friends, my family, my neighborhood. And that's why I feel like the more power should be pushed towards the individual, those rights that are guaranteed by our Constitution, and then to the localist of levels when it comes to city council, state government, and then of course certain responsibilities that we give and power that we give to the federal government. And I want to keep the federal government very limited so that we as individuals have more ability to make individual decisions. Now, as a party, and the Republican Party best represents that overall philosophy, the Republican Party, was the one that I felt better represented what I believed in with individual liberty. And so that's why I always remind folks, at 17, I determined that I'm a conservative, and at 18, I registered to be a Republican. But the Republican Party is made of individuals, and individuals, as we know from our own personal lives and our families and our friends, are fallible, and they make mistakes. And so we may not like a particular candidate, and by no means does an individual candidate, even a local city councilman, all the way up to the president of the United States, necessarily perfectly fit with that overall vision that you and I might have when it comes to how we want to govern our lives. But we make the best of it, whether we're Democrats or Republicans. And within the parties, there are great varieties of people. Within the Republican Party, for example, there are more libertarian Republicans, there are more socially conservative Republicans, there are more economically focused Republicans. I think that the one thing that attracts me to the Republican Party that I think is in common is that in the end, most conservative Republicans want to be, just to put it very bluntly, to be left alone. Some people want to be left alone with their guns. Some people want to be left alone on how to raise their kids and how to educate their kids. Some people want to be left alone on how they worship. Some people want to be left alone on how they engage in commerce and establish their business and run their lives, or run their property or their ranch, etc. But in the end, we agree that, I live in Washington, D.C. I don't have any guns. That's not something that, I live and breathe about, but I care about my local issues when it comes to education and healthcare in the Washington, D.C. metro area. But I feel that I can make those decisions better than, say, a government bureaucrat. So that's what makes me, work in common with, say, a rancher in Montana who's worried about his rights over his local ranch. So that's kind of the philosophy, and that you carve out that individual niche for yourself as you become engaged in the political arena.
Yeah, man, that's a question that I actually get all the time. And what I try to tell people is that what's fundamentally at stake in this election is the nature of this country and what this country stands for, and that Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden have much more in common in terms of their belief in what America represents, both at home and abroad. And if you look at the issues from their philosophies on healthcare, about having affordable healthcare, access to affordable education, climate change, for example, there's major issues where they're in significant alignment, even if they may be 5 or 10% off on the tactics or how they would choose to implement it as president. So what unites us in this election to win in November is far greater than what divides us. And that includes the ideas of judicial appointments with the Supreme Court and other in the federal judiciary broadly, and other policies like the Muslim ban on immigration and things like that. There's just far more alignment between those two campaigns than with President Trump. So I try to talk about the commonalities and hope that we don't focus as much on the differences going into November.
Yeah, I think one thing that young people should understand is, I think as humans, we all have similar goals in life. That we're all headed towards the same types of things that we want. It's just how to go about doing them. And it's never worth the fight of the journey at all, because you don't disagree on the goal. So the question is, how are you going to make the journey? And I think the less partisan we are, and the going back to the Bush and Reagan type of Republican era, it was just a lot more tolerant, and there were ways that people dealt with each other that were just much more dignified. And I fear the loss of that. And I can see that you younger people are probably wondering how, how it ever got to this level, or you maybe never saw anything different. But there was a time when people worked across the aisles together. They never disagreed on the goal at the end of the day. We all want the same basic things. It's just how you go about doing it. And on that journey, you have to walk with some level of mutual respect and some ability to compromise and, make things easier on people.
If I can add to that, that is something that I'm very concerned about, and that is the issue of civility in our public discourse. And there's no doubt that both sides of the aisle are guilty of, transgressing when it comes to the incivility that we see, particularly online, because sometimes it's easier to be, mean or coarse in our language when it's online because we're comfortable and anonymous behind our keyboards than we might be if we're in person. But I can tell you again, from so many times that I've been able to be a part of getting legislation passed or working on an important issue, that it really takes bipartisanship. It takes relationship building, as Sarah already articulated. It requires trust across the aisle. And, my motto has always been, even if we disagree on 9 issues, if we agree on the 10th, let's work on that 10th issue together so we can get that issue accomplished. And criminal justice reform is one of those things that we're seeing. There is a lot of, overlap between the two parties on that we need to do something about that issue. Now, there are definitely different disagreements on how we accomplish that, as Sarah articulated, on how we get there. But we can do that in a meaningful and in a civil manner. There is something in the House of Representatives called the Problem Solver Caucus, and that's Republicans and Democrats who get together on a regular basis. They offer bills together. They have a rule that they'll only introduce legislation if they have a member of the opposing party as a co-sponsor. And they unfortunately don't get as much attention in our media because, and I'm not trying to be critical of our media because I think the media plays an important role, but one negative part of our media is that it does tend to sensationalize our politics. It does tend to sensationalize issues and particularly look for disagreements. And if you watch press conferences, whether they be of President Trump or of Nancy Pelosi or of Chuck Schumer or Mitch McConnell or of the many governors across our country, oftentimes you'll hear members of the media ask questions that are deliberately provocative in order to get them to kind of take a shot at their, at somebody from the opposing party. And it takes a lot of self-control, whether they be Democrat or Republican, not to engage in that incivility, because that's what, unfortunately, what sells newspapers or, clicks on websites. So that's a constant challenge. But I say all of that because I want young people who have strongly held beliefs as they become engaged in the political arena or may already be engaged in the political arena to remember that we all are Americans and that we all, as Sarah said, have a fundamental care for our country. We may disagree on the way that we get to universal health care or prosperity for all Americans or, a high level of educational opportunity for all Americans, etc. But in the end, that we do have a goal in common, and that just from a very, base level, that we should just be kind to our neighbors, our friends, and our fellow Americans.
Okay, well, we are starting to wrap up. I just want to remind all the participants, any questions you may have, just please submit them in the chat box. I'll be more than happy to relay it to our panelists. And we've been talking now for about an hour, so I feel like now we're all family and we can get to a couple of things that have popped up a couple times. It's clear, Farouk, who you are supporting in the upcoming election. And I want to ask the tough questions for you, Sohaila and Sarah, about what is 2020, the outlook look for you guys?
So for me, I'm going to be definitely working on a campaign. I always go at every cycle, so I try to take my own advice. I try to identify an elected official that I feel passionately about, and also might be in a tough race. So over the years, I've worked in California, my home state, Colorado, Louisiana, Pennsylvania. Gosh, Virginia. I've worked in so many different states and met different people. I haven't determined which candidate I'm going to go out for this cycle, but there are a lot of choices. On the presidential side, I voted Libertarian in the 2016 cycle. I haven't have not made a determination come 2020 because I do have concerns about both ticket leaders of both ticket. And so that's something I'm going to be, watching and monitoring. But I still will remain engaged. And like I said, it's not just the presidential. There are so many other candidates out there. And so I'll definitely be out there, either boots on the ground or virtually, for at least one candidate come the fall.
On my front, I'm going to continue to stay engaged locally as a delegate to the 10th district here. I was struggling when I was approached to become one with the concept of, first of all, being a minority and then a Republican. I've already endured over the years a certain level of bashing from the minority community for belonging to this party. And then I've also felt very not included in the party itself as a minority. So it's kind of like stuck between a rock and a hard place. So I've spoken to a lot of good people that I trust in the Republican Party, and I felt encouraged that even if I can't make a huge difference, I can at least try to do what I can. So I plan to stay engaged at the local level, go to the convention. I'm not so worried about the larger election because I think it is what it is. It's not something I can control, but I would encourage everybody to do, and I do this at a local level too. I really encourage people to sort of be critical of the media that they consume, because that is going to shape your mind. We went through the agrarian age, the industrial age. We're now in the information age. So people can play with your mind. All this barrage of information can really, really affect people. You can see that in the malaise these days, and high suicide rates and young people feeling really disenfranchised and lost. But so I'd encourage people to look into how media affects your opinions and shapes your mind, and just really get involved at the local level. And that's what I plan to do too.
Great, I appreciate that. And I just really want to highlight again the importance of working within our community regardless of party issues, party affiliations. Last year, I just want to share a brief story of my experience with YLI. We had an advocacy day on Capitol Hill, and we were meeting with Marco Rubio's staff, who I'm emotionally conflicted about this man at times, but when it comes to the issue on China and what's happening to the Muslim minorities in that country, he's fantastic on the issue. And I thought it was really amazing to see these young leaders who have only been exposed to what the Republican Party is at the highest office and disagree with the way that our president has been handling situations, but to see a senator who is part of the party, who cares about the issues they cared about. It was an eye-opening experience for myself, as well as an opportunity for young leaders to see that people on both sides of the aisle can equally care about the issues that pertain to our communities. I thought that was a very important moment. I'm very grateful that our young leaders got to experience that. I just, again, want to encourage, I've been asking all the questions, and our participants out there have some already great ones. If there's anybody else that has questions, to put them in the box. But I do want to open it up to all of our participants. If there's anything I didn't ask or things that you really want to touch on that you want to leave with our young leaders, I just wanted to take this opportunity to open the platform to you. We don't have to jump at once.
I'll just say again, thank you. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I'm grateful to be part of the opportunity because I remember, getting involved as somebody who was really new to the system, didn't have much guidance as to how do you register, how do you get involved, would a campaign be open to somebody like me, and it was, and it has been, and it's been an amazing experience. So if there's, one thing I just really want to leave with folks that are tuning in, and that is, the water is nice, get involved, and that involvement might be just you getting registered and voting, or it might be more than that, getting involved in actually a campaign and becoming somebody that works and becomes a passionate volunteer or even staff member for a campaign or elected official. And then for some of you, like me, seeking out a lifelong career in the political and public policy arena. It is amazing. It's great for you as a person and in your intellectual growth, your sense of contributing to our country and the growth and stability and betterment of our country, but also for the country, that our democracy, as was said in the beginning of our forum, is as only as good as the people that participate in that democracy. And so really it's for all of us to engage. We don't all have to agree on how we might accomplish a particular goal, but we have to remain engaged. And that's why I'm so grateful to really be a part of this and to encourage everyone to engage to the level and degree that they feel they can.
Yeah, and for me, this is a unique time in our nation's history, and every vote is going to matter. Every volunteer can make an impact wherever you are at any level of government, and it's just so important. There's just so much at stake that really impacts our day-to-day life. And I remember getting involved when I was like a sophomore in college. I actually, now that I think back, I'm like, man, I kind of waited too long. I should have been more engaged when I was in high school. So, there's always an opportunity. And Sohail made a lot of good points about ballot initiatives and your local party, Democrat or Republican. It's just so important to be involved and to make sure that everyone's voices are heard and to just be part of the process.
We actually just got a very interesting question from a participant. I think everybody on the panel can see it, but just in case. They ask, you mentioned the underrepresentation of the bipartisan action group. How do you feel about platforms like YALU that make an effort to moderate the pros and cons of issues without bias?
I think, I'm careful about that because, like it or not, we do have a party system. And so even though, more and more Americans are identifying less with either party, Republican or Democrat, more and more Americans are calling themselves independents. What's interesting about that, though, is when you look at those independents, they 90% vote one way or the other. So they're getting rid of the brand Republican or Democrat, but they're still voting Republican or Democrat. So that's just very interesting. And that's just, as we've already said earlier, there are just people that, for a host of reasons, whether they be Democrats or Republicans, don't want to call themselves that anymore. But for all intents and purposes, for the most part, we get things done through the legislative process. And in most states, and for that matter, on the federal level, we get them done through the parties. And so I do believe in bipartisanship, and the Problem Solver Caucus is a great example of that in the House of Representatives. But when you have nonpartisan groups, sometimes they're just kind of the odd bedfellow that nobody, because they're nonpartisan, nobody trusts them. So I would rather have a conservative Republican or a liberal Democrat come and say, hey, look, this is what my team jersey is, but I agree with you on, say, criminal justice reform. Let's work on that together. Then saying, look, I'm kind of a wishy-washy person in the middle who doesn't have a party, and so trust me. And that just tends to be the ethos that may be for the better or worse situation. But that's why when you have third, party candidates, for example, Bernie, I worked with Bernie when he was in the House for years, when he was openly a socialist, and he would join with us on lots of civil libertarian issues, including with conservative Republicans like me. But he found in order to run for president successfully, he had to register as a Democrat. And the same goes for Donald Trump, who for years was a Democrat, then became a Reform Party candidate, or at least individual. And then he realized that if he was going to run for president, he had to choose a party, and he chose the Republican Party. So that is kind of the reality of our political system.
Great. I got two very interesting ones. The first one is directed towards Sohail and Sarah, and the second one I'll open up to all three. Sohail and Sarah both spoke about how the Republican Party changed from when you first joined it. Your reasons for joining are very eye-opening. In general, does a person join a party for what it is now or what has it become? And the second part to that question is for individuals and young voters who just feel like their vote doesn't matter. What's the consequence of them not voting?
Great questions. So the first part of the question was, do you join a party based on what it was or what it is? Well, obviously you're living in the moment. You have to first do a lot of self-reflection as to what are my core values and where is that represented. So it could be that 20 years ago you would identify with the Republican Party, but fast forward to now, you're thinking, oh, you know what? based on my original value set, I think I'm going to go Democrat this time. So I can't really tell you where to find yourself, but it requires a lot of self-reflection. And I would say that you need to be with the entity that represents who you are at the time that you want to get involved. That would be probably the wisest thing to do, because the parties of old are the parties of old. They're gone. The second question, which was about what was that, Iman?
What would you, yeah, somebody who feels their vote doesn't matter and the consequence of not voting.
Oh, yes. So what is the biggest effect of COVID-19? Everybody has been what? Stuck at home. You are the master of your domain at home. You are running everything you want the way you want in your house right now. So it's the same concept. If you don't get involved in your household, you're going to be the person sitting at the dining table eating by yourself. If you don't want to participate in what's happening locally or in politics, you cannot be the person who gets up and says, I don't like this, because you know what? You didn't do anything about it. So if everybody put in that little bit of effort and contributed to the fabric of that participation in their immediate area, then that's how change comes about. But if everybody sat back and said, heck, I'm not contributing to dinner, you know, you don't get to eat that meal without having to at least clean up afterwards. So my thing to that is, and I do have 4 young kids, they're all adults and they can all vote, but sometimes they don't feel as motivated. And I think it's because they hear all this over hyper messaging of everything, and they have their opinions and they will randomly go and participate in an election here and there where they feel motivated to. But I think that you should be consistent about staying involved, finding out what the issues are and where your heart lies, because honestly, you can't shape the world for your future generation or even for your own future if you're not going to participate. So it's a real loss. If there's any system in the world that allows the average person to get involved at even the most amazing levels of political participation or civic participation, it is this country. So make use of it. I mean, a lot of us came from immigrant backgrounds where we were in countries where this opportunity never existed. You couldn't even speak politics in public arenas. It was dangerous. So it's a breath of fresh air, and you should take advantage of it and don't let your voice go unheard.
I'll agree with everything that was said. I'll add on the political affiliation issue in the party, in that the parties do evolve, and both parties have evolved in different directions over the years. And that's partially because of the demographics of the country, but partially because of the candidates. You know, in 2016, you know, we had 18, 19 Republicans that were running for president. Donald Trump was able to win. And so for right now, it is Donald Trump's party. But the party will long be in place after Donald Trump comes and goes as president. And the same goes, you know, when you had a party that was represented by Bill Clinton, and then it became Barack Obama's president. When he was president, his party, and the parties change and evolve. And you see different blocks of Americans shift from one party to another. And so, as Sarah said, you definitely have to determine which party best reflects the values that you hope to promote. But I also will argue that if you have a core set of principles that attracted you to the party, you also, for me at least, I believe I need to stay and participate and fight within my party to continue to represent those values. And even though we might stray because of some particular time that we live in, for example, post 9/11, or now during the COVID, we might shift, that it's for people like us within our party to engage and to remind our fellow party members of what our party is all about. So it really is a personal decision, and each of us have to make those decisions as they engage in the political arena. On the second question, I can't tell you how many times I've been on political races where a handful of votes have meant winning or losing. I worked on a race in Seattle in 2002 where the congressional candidate, sorry, that was Denver in Colorado, the congressional candidate by 22 votes. In Seattle in 2006, I worked for a congressional candidate who likewise won by just a handful of votes. Of course, before that in 2000, in Florida, George W. Bush, then the governor, won Florida and therefore the presidency by 521 votes. So it can just be, and of course there are local races where it's just been a handful, literally 3, 4, 5 votes that can turn an election. So does your vote matter? Absolutely it matters. It matters more on the local level, but it's increasingly meaning more on the federal level because we are such a divided country, because elections are so close. And if you live in a Virginia, Ohio, Florida, Arizona, you know, in Colorado, the list is long of swing states, your vote means that much more because that state vote turnout can tip an election on a national scale like it did in Florida in 2000, and we saw Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio did in the 2016 cycle. So your vote matters, and the moment you text a couple friends and say, hey, make sure you vote and vote for this candidate, you can begin organizing your friends, your family, your neighbors to vote in a particular direction, and that can make or break lots of races. So yes, your vote does matter. Don't ever underestimate it. As I said in the beginning of this call, you know, I was privileged to walk with Congressman John Lewis, a great civil rights leader who marched with Dr. King. People gave their lives for the vote. We're just celebrating the anniversary of women, the right that women have now to vote in our democracy. So let's not take that for granted.
I'd like to really quickly add to that I think when you do that soul searching, know that not either party is going to represent 100% of what you believe in. So be open to saying, yes, I belong in this general pot, but I may not agree with 100%, because, you know, I have some of those issues where I have to sit down and think, well, I'm not 100% on board with this. And usually there's social issues. I don't know if Sohail's the same way. Usually it's social issues, not so much the fiscal and the other side. So yeah, be brave about it.
I can't say anything different than what was just said. I'll let you know, Sohail, you articulated.
Come on over to the other side, Farouk.
Great. Well, I just want to thank everybody. We've actually gone over our time because I just loved speaking to all of you. And thank you just for being so authentic and real about everything. I think this is so important for young leaders to hear this kind of a dialogue. So thank you to Farouk, thank you to Sarah, thank you to Sohail, and everybody who participated in this special webinar. I just wanted to remind everybody that becoming a great leader is consistency, and YLI takes that very serious. This is just one of many webinars, and the next one, which stay tuned on their social media, is going to be about conflict resolution. Before I invite Nadia Hassan back on, just to close everything up, I wanted to take a moment and actually just read verbatim her statement, her open letter that she just wrote to George Floyd. I think this has been on a lot of our minds, and I want to make sure I close with this note that she posted. Your skin color is not a crime, but you were criminalized anyway. You were murdered on public display by your government, the ones who brought you here against your will. You died physically, they died mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. You are light, though your skin is dark, and they are black, though their skin is light. They will perish in darkness, and you will live on in glory. What they don't realize is that before they stole your beautiful soul from us, they gifted you eternal bliss and global adoration. While they earned humanity's wrath forever, my promise to you, George, is I will work hard to encourage more and more young people to turn out their votes this November as a means to exterminate racism from America's core. I think this is just important. Everybody's been very moved. And Nadia, if I'd like to invite you back up to close our session more formally.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank the panelists. You all did such a wonderful job, and it is truly an honor to have all of you guys on here. And I know that I'm getting messages privately from a lot of our young leaders who are saying that they have learned so much from you, and that they want to stay engaged. And so if there are opportunities for us to get our young people involved, I would definitely want to work closer with you to get them out there volunteering. You know, we recently had a 3-week webinar, not a webinar, I'm sorry, a training prior to COVID, a 3-week training on teaching young people how to get involved in campaigns and teaching them how to phone bank and knock on doors and go out canvassing and what to say and all of that great stuff. So definitely let's stay connected, let's work together, let's get more of our young people involved, giving them that purpose and allowing them to understand that their votes, their participation will make a difference in shaping our future. And with that, I would just like to say thank you all and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.